The next thing to do is to get the frets to the proper radius, and I'm using these EVO gold frets. The guy that this is for is a big fan of these, and he has a bunch of these laying around because he has me put them in all of his guitars. They're a little more narrow than like your regular jumbo frets, and they're a little harder than nickel frets, but not quite as hard as stainless steel. And they're nice and gold in color, and you know, what more do you want than that? This one I already bent off camera just to dial in this little fret bender, and if you don't have a fret bender, get a fret bender. Let's just do it, because it's going to make your life way easier. This one is really nice. I used to have another one, or I still have it, where you had to just push it through, and it's a huge pain. This one's a bit expensive. I don't remember exactly how much, but it's worth every penny. It's from G-Tech Guitar Works, which I think I bought it on eBay. Well worth it. So if you look at these two, you can see the one on top is much less round because I haven't rounded that one yet. So to do this, you just feed it in through the little groove on that top bearing and just kind of push it and turn that. And I like to do it from both directions so that the ends of the piece get bent as well. Maybe even feed it through twice on each end. And now, still not quite as round as the other one. And keep feeding it a little bit. Might have accidentally loosened this up because it's not as round as the other ones were. So now I guess you get to see me do that. So I loosen this up and then loosen this thumb screw, and that makes it ever so slightly more round. Cool. Now it's the same radius. I'm going to do the rest of these, and I'm not going to change the setting on here until I'm done with this. Alright, you can see there's just the slightest gap right in the middle underneath those tangs. And that's what I want, so that when I hammer these in, that little bit of gap will be gone. The fret will flatten out into there. If these were stainless steel, I would want to get that gap slightly smaller, because stainless steel likes to spring back a bit, but with these you can get away with being just a little more round in the fretboard. I'm going to start off by cutting these all to length, and it's hard to get this whole thing over right here, but I always start from the end because this is where it's widest, and I try to cut it as close to the final width as possible. But since I start down here, if I accidentally cut it too short, I can just move it up and use it for one of the lower frets. If I do this, start up here and then try to cut it as close as possible and cut it too short, then that fret's wasted. So I always start from this end, and I'm gonna do my best to kind of get this close, but you know, it's kind of hard because the rest of the guitar's in the way. And now, double check, it's longer than it needs to be. And I have this block that I made. There's 24 holes drilled in it, and that was fret 15, 17, 19, 20, 21. So I put it in number 21. And then on to the next fret. This one I'm not going to worry about getting as close as possible because I'm not going to be able to use the excess from this one anyway. Cool. This next step is unique to fretting next with binding. Because the slot doesn't go all the way through, it stops at the binding. You need to cut away part of this tang in order to go over the binding. And I have this tool from Summit that does this better than anything else I've used. They're expensive, but you get what you pay for. And if you can't afford one of those, one of these will get it done because you have to get in there and file it later anyway, but it's a real pain with these. First time I did it, I used one of these and it sucked. And then the next time I did it, I used the Tang nipper and it was way easier. So definitely worth the investment if you're going to be doing these a lot. But if you only plan on doing this once, maybe not so much. That's up to you. But for me, it's absolutely essential. I don't ever want to do it without this. So what you do is, I've got it lined up, the fret lined up here so I can kind of gauge how much I need to cut away, and I just start nibbling, but you only want to take small bites. So you want to get just a little bit in there and just nibble it. Do the same thing on the other side, another little bite. If you try to take off too much, it won't cut, or it won't cut clean, or you can end up twisting the fret. So that's why I just take off little tiny bites. And then I'm going to check. Nope, not quite enough. And since these frets are slightly overbent, when I hammer them down, those tangs are going to push out slightly. So I don't want to be right up against the binding. I want to be slightly under. And I'm really close. Just another nibble. Another little nibble. That's pretty good. Now, just as an extra insurance, I like to take just this little corner. So just a little corner like that. And so it's angled in a little bit. That way, if there's any gunk or anything that's right up against the binding in the bottom of the slot, that prevents the fret from bumping into it. Same thing on the other side. It's a little. And then we're going to come back and file those tangs later, but I'll show you that in the next step. So the next very important step when you're doing frets for binding, right off of the cutter from the tang nippers, you can see it's kind of rough where it cuts the tang off. And we can't leave that, because then you're going to see some little ugly tang at the bottom of the fret, and it will also stop it from sitting properly and just won't look good and won't work well. So I take this file, which has a flat edge ground on it right here. This is a Crimson Guitars fret and dressing file, although I use it for all kinds of things, and it's really good for this. And I have this little block that I made that has a concave groove in it that I put there just with some sandpaper on a fret and just sanded it in there. And I sanded it in a little bit further right here so that that holds the fret, stops it from rocking all over the place. If you don't have something like this to hold it, it's a real pain to try to hold on to this while you file it, but with this little block, it makes it pretty easy. And I just file away. Try to make sure that you're not rounding it, you're just filing a flat spot on there. And you don't need to make the whole thing disappear. You need it just like that. See how it's flat now? You can see all those little scratch marks. And then when you install the fret, put a little bit of glue under there, you won't see any gaps. So I'll do the same thing. The other one now. Real simple, but tedious and has to be done on all of these. And this step is the reason why you end up charging more for a refret with binding than you do for a refret that doesn't have binding. You also charge a little bit more because cleaning out the fret slots is a little trickier, because you can't run a saw all the way through the slots because you'll cut the binding. But I'll show you how to do that in the next step. This is why I have my little fret holding block, so that I can keep track of each fret, because remember, each one of these is cut specific to each fret. The next step here is cleaning out the fret slots. As you can see, there's a bunch of dust that's been kind of packed into there from sanding the fretboard, and unfortunately I don't have a compressor, because the first step should be to blow this off. I mean, really you should be blowing that off every time you take off the radius beam to look at the fretboard. You should be blowing it off, but I don't have a compressor, so that's why I didn't do it. And I would imagine a lot of people watching this probably also don't have a compressor. But I'm going to use this tool from StewMac. It's called a hook tool. If you don't have one of these, you can also use an X-Acto knife. It doesn't work as well as this one does, but it'll get the job done. I've done it a lot of times with an X-Acto knife. I'd also like to add, this is probably my least favorite step when it comes to doing a refret, is cleaning out the fret slots and making sure they're to the right depth and everything. It's a real pain, but it's part of the job. Has to be done. So I just start by scraping out all this dust, and I'm doing this kind of backwards because the camera's in my way, but I want you to be able to see this. So I'm just getting in there and scraping away dust. And this is just to get out all that loose stuff, because there's definitely some glue down in those slots that I have to clean out. I can see it right there. There's some glue I can't even pull through. So just break out all the loose stuff. And you don't want to force this, because if you force it, it'll have the same problem when pulling out frets. It'll just grab a piece of wood and just rip it out. And of course, we don't want that. You want to take one of these triangle files, and again, I'm doing this backwards, so bear with me. But you just, no, I can't do that backwards. Sorry. If you can't see this that well, I apologize. Oh no, you can see it fine. But you just want to very, very lightly break that edge. And the reason for this is because I'm about to go in here with a little refret saw to clean that out, and breaking that edge stops that saw from getting caught on things. And I also need to do that anyway because later having the slots beveled like that makes it a little easier to seat the fret in there, and it also prevents tear out from any future refrets. I have this little tool, again from StewMac, that works really well for cleaning out fret slots. It has teeth that cut on the pull and on the push, and I use both. So just get in there, see where that glue is. I'm gonna just saw it away. Let me come from the other side so you guys can see that a little better. Grab the hook tool again, just scrape out that dust, and basically you have to keep going back and forth with these two until you got the slot nice and clean. Again, this is very hard to do with the camera in the way here, so now that I've kind of shown you the technique, I'm going to go to a wider angle. Just going to take a moment, and for these frets that are over the body, I'm just going to mark with a Sharpie on the end, right where it'll be at the end of the fretboard. And I'm going to take these frets over to my belt sander and grind them down a little bit before I install them, because that'll save me some time filing the ends of the frets after I install them. One last thing I want to do before the frets go in is just to take a little bit of this butcher block conditioner. It's just mineral oil and wax, and so when I put some glue in here later, none of the glue will stick to the fretboard. So I'll run just like a little bit of bead of glue along the fret. It'll run underneath there, and since this is going to be on here, the glue that's on the fretboard will just right off. So I don't want to put on much though, because I'm going to put on more after the frets. I don't want to get a bunch of this in the fret slots, but I got it in a couple spots, so I'm going to go back and with my hook tool and wipe that stuff out. One other thing I forgot to mention, I have this tool, another StewMac tool, seems to be a recurring theme here, that lets you check the depth of these slots, and there's a radius here for 7 1/4 to 9 1/2, which is what this is. And I don't know how well that's showing up on the camera, if I turn on that light. And that top line is just barely showing, and in that one it's not showing at all, and that's what you want. Usually just up to that first line there, and that'll be deep enough. If you don't have one of these, I mean, they're super cheap, but if you don't have one, you can use an X-Acto knife and mark off with a piece of tape where you want your depth to be, and then you just poke that in there and you can see that it's deep enough. Alright, we're about ready to pop in these frets now. Alright, so I'm going to start from this end, and right here I need to be pretty careful. I'm using a little radius call and a hammer. So some people like to use the fret press with one of these, some people like to hammer with just that. I like to do both. I find that when you use the call from the fret press, when you hammer this in, it just goes in a little smoother and a little more evenly. And I'll show you right now. It doesn't take, I don't have to smack the hell out of this. It's just a nice little tap. And you can hear it starting to bottom out. Then I take my feeler gauge, which I am finding off camera, right here. So the 2.5. So it's pretty good at the ends. A little bit of a gap in the middle. I'm just gonna, and that ought to do it. There's still a little bit in the middle there. Let's see if we can make that any better. I don't mind a little gap in the middle to the ends that you really need to worry about. If it's just slightly, like, see, it's like barely catching in the middle, you're never gonna see that. And that's my phone going off right in the middle of recording. That one's nice and seated, like I was saying. You know, the feeler gauge, it's catching like ever so slightly right there, but you're not really gonna see that, and it's not gonna be an issue. So now I'll go on to the next one. And you can see there's a little piece of tear out there that popped up as I was cleaning out the fret slot. I could have filled it and then sanded the whole fretboard again, but that would take forever. So I'm just going to leave it, and then I'm going to fix it after the fact with a little bit of ebony dust and glue, maybe even just a little bit of black super glue, and it should be basically invisible. Grab my little caul, and you know, try to hold this by the ends, otherwise you're gonna smack your finger and it's not gonna feel good. So now all of the frets are installed, and you can see just at the end of each fret I put a little dot of super glue so that it runs under the fret and holds it in place. And you can see on this side that glue that's going along the binding, some of the binding was delaminating from the neck, and you can see where it's even cracked in some spots, like right there's a crack. But that glue is just there to stop that binding from popping off anymore. Alright, now I'm going to file in the ends of those. Actually, some of those I'm going to, like these, I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to file everything flush. Okay, so I already filed one end flush, and now I'm going to show you how I did it on the other side. So I start with a very coarse file, and you have to be careful with this one because it doesn't have a safe edge on it. So even with this tape here, if I dig in, it's going to go right through, but I'll just not do that. But I'll start over the body here and get it as close as I can with this. Certainly don't want to take this all the way up to the edge of the fretboard. I have finer files for that. I'm also keeping this slightly angled inward like this, so that way once I get close and flush, I'm not digging into the side of the fretboard. And this is a lot easier on a neck that isn't attached to a body, especially when the body is this nice big jazz box like we have here. I'm going to move on to my medium grit file. And you could do the whole thing with this one, but it's just going to take you a lot longer. And now finish up with my fine file. After I'm done with the files, I have this aluminum U-channel with some 320 grit on it that I use on the ends there just to clean up the scratches. Saves me a little time later when it comes time to polish through the frets. It's a lot easier to sand out scratches from 320 grit than it is to sand out file marks.